There's a cough in the subway car. Just one. But everyone turns. In that split second, a dozen minds race through the same calculation. Is it just a cold? Allergies? Or is it the thing that's been moving through the office, through the school, through the city like an invisible wave? We live in a world where a single sneeze can shift the mood of an entire room, where the arrival of fall brings not just changing leaves but a collective bracing for what's coming. Influenza. The word itself carries weight. Not the dramatic weight of plague or pandemic, but something more insidious. The familiar threat. The seasonal visitor that never truly leaves. Before we go further, if you're settling in for this journey through time and microscopic warfare, hit that like button and subscribe. This is the kind of story that takes time to tell properly, and I want to make sure you catch the next one. And here's my question for you tonight. Tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. Are you in New York at 2 in the morning? London at dawn? Sydney in the afternoon? Drop it in the comments. I'm curious who's awake with me, chasing stories in the dark. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's go in. We begin not with certainty but with shadows. The historical record of influenza is a frustrating puzzle. Pieces scattered across millennia, many lost forever to time and the limitations of ancient medicine. The ancients knew fevers. They knew coughs that seized entire communities. They knew the way sickness could move like wind through a population, striking the young and old with particular cruelty. But they didn't know influenza as a distinct entity. They couldn't. The tools didn't exist. The microscope was centuries away. The germ theory of disease was an unimaginable future. What they had were observations, patterns, the accumulated wisdom of watching people suffer and sometimes survive. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, described an epidemic in ancient Greece around 412 BCE. The symptoms read like influenza. Sudden fever, cough, body aches that made movement agony. It swept through the population with speed, then faded. Was it influenza? We can't know for certain. The description fits, but it could fit other respiratory diseases as well. What matters is this. Thousands of years ago, humans were already documenting the phenomenon of respiratory illness that moved in waves, appearing and disappearing with seasonal regularity. They noticed that these illnesses often came with the cold months. They noticed that once you survived one outbreak, you might be protected for a time, but not forever. The disease learned. It changed. It came back wearing a different face. The first pandemic we can say with reasonable confidence was influenza occurred in 1580. It began in Asia, moved through Africa, spread into Europe, and leaped the Atlantic to the Americas. This was significant not because the disease was new, but because human civilization had reached a point of interconnection where a respiratory virus could circle the globe. The age of exploration had unintended consequences. Ships carried more than goods and ideas. They carried microscopic passengers that thrived in the close quarters of sailing vessels, in the crowded ports where sailors mixed with local populations. The 1580 pandemic was documented across multiple continents with consistent symptom descriptions. High fever, extreme fatigue, respiratory distress, and a death toll that, while not catastrophic by medieval standards, was notable enough to be recorded by physicians and chroniclers across different cultures. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, influenza outbreaks became a recognized pattern. They arrived with brutal efficiency, peaked within weeks, then receded. Doctors began to suspect these outbreaks were caused by something transmissible, something that passed from person to person, though the mechanism remained mysterious. The prevailing theory for much of this period was miasma, bad air. The belief that diseases arose from foul vapors, from swamps and decay, from the exhalations of the earth itself. It wasn't entirely wrong. Crowded, unsanitary conditions did correlate with disease outbreaks. But the reasoning was backwards. It wasn't the air itself making people sick. It was what traveled through the air. Droplets, particles, the exhaled breath of the infected. The 19th century brought scientific revolution, but influenza remained elusive. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch were proving that specific microorganisms caused specific diseases. Anthrax, tuberculosis, cholera. One by one, the invisible killers were being identified, isolated, understood. But influenza resisted. Researchers would examine samples from flu patients under microscopes and find bacteria. They assumed these bacteria were the cause. In 1892, a German physician named Richard Pfeiffer identified a bacterium he called Bacillus influenzae, now known as Haemophilus influenzae. For decades, the scientific community believed this was the culprit. It wasn't. The bacterium was often present in flu patients, but it was a secondary infection, an opportunist taking advantage of tissues already damaged by the real invader. The true cause of influenza was smaller than bacteria. It was a virus. But in the 1890s, viruses hadn't been discovered yet. The concept of a filterable agent, something that could pass through porcelain filters fine enough to stop bacteria, emerged in the late 19th century. Russian scientist Dmitry Ivanovsky and Dutch microbiologist Martinus Beijerinck worked with tobacco mosaic disease and realized they were dealing with something fundamentally different from bacteria. The word virus, from the Latin for poison or slime, began to take on new meaning. But it would take decades more before virology became a mature science, before electron microscopes could actually visualize these entities, before their structure and behavior could be understood. Influenza virus wouldn't be isolated and identified until 1933 by British scientists Wilson Smith, Christopher Andrews, and Patrick Laidlaw. They worked with ferrets, which turned out to be susceptible to human influenza, and finally proved that the disease was caused by a virus, not a bacterium. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before science could name and categorize influenza, the virus demonstrated exactly how devastating it could be. The year 1918, the final year of the First World War. Trenches across Europe were filled with millions of soldiers living in conditions perfect for disease transmission. Close quarters, stress, malnutrition, poor sanitation. And then it arrived. A flu unlike any that had come before. It started unremarkably. Spring of 1918, military camps in the United States reported outbreaks of respiratory illness. Soldiers got sick, most recovered, some died. It seemed like typical flu. Then the virus disappeared over the summer, and officials hoped it had burned out. It hadn't. It was evolving. In August 1918, the second wave hit. This time, the virus had changed. This time, it was a killer. And it didn't follow the normal pattern of influenza, which typically hits the very young, the very old, and the immunocompromised hardest. This strain attacked healthy young adults with terrifying efficiency. Men and women in their 20s and 30s, in the prime of life, were dying within days of symptom onset. Their lungs filled with fluid. They turned blue from lack of oxygen, a condition called cyanosis. They drowned in their own bodies. Hospitals overflowed. Morgues ran out of space. Cities implemented mask mandates, closed schools and theaters, banned public gatherings. None of it was enough. The virus moved too fast. The 1918 influenza pandemic, often called the Spanish flu though it didn't originate in Spain, killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people worldwide. To put that in perspective, World War I, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, killed approximately 20 million people over 4 years. The flu killed 2 to 5 times that number in roughly 18 months. It infected about 1/3 of the global population. In some communities, so many people fell ill simultaneously that basic services collapsed. There weren't enough healthy people to care for the sick, to bury the dead, to keep society functioning. In Philadelphia, the death toll climbed so high that bodies were left in homes for days because there was no one to collect them. Mass graves were dug. In India, the death toll may have reached 17 million. In Alaska, entire indigenous villages were wiped out. What made the 1918 strain so deadly? Scientists have spent over a century trying to fully answer that question. In 2005, researchers successfully reconstructed the virus from tissue samples preserved from 1918 victims, including a woman whose body had been buried in Alaskan permafrost. What they found was a virus that had likely jumped from birds to humans, possibly with an intermediate step through pigs. It was an H1N1 strain, and it had several genetic features that made it exceptionally virulent. One key factor was the virus's ability to trigger a massive immune response called a cytokine storm. In healthy young adults, who have robust immune systems, the virus provoked such an aggressive immune reaction that the immune system itself caused much of the damage, flooding the lungs with fluid and inflammatory cells. The body's defense mechanism became a weapon against itself. The 1918 pandemic eventually ended, not because humans defeated it, but because the virus evolved toward less lethal forms and because so many people had been infected that population immunity increased. But the H1N1 strain didn't disappear. It continued to circulate, causing seasonal flu outbreaks of varying severity for decades. Influenza had proven it could be more than an annual nuisance. It could be an existential threat. And humanity had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that respiratory viruses could spread globally with devastating speed, even in an era before air travel. The decades following 1918 saw enormous advances in understanding influenza. The virus was finally isolated in 1933. Researchers discovered that influenza wasn't one single virus but a family of viruses with different types. Influenza A, Influenza B, and eventually Influenza C. Influenza A turned out to be the most dangerous, capable of causing pandemics, and the most diverse, with numerous subtypes based on two surface proteins: hemagglutinin, abbreviated H, and neuraminidase, abbreviated N. These proteins are the keys the virus uses to invade cells and spread. They're also the targets our immune systems recognize. The naming system for flu strains comes from these proteins: H1N1, H3N2, H5N1. Each combination represents a different configuration of these surface proteins, and each configuration interacts differently with the human immune system. One of the most important discoveries about influenza was antigenic drift and antigenic shift. Drift is the slow accumulation of small mutations in the virus's genetic code. RNA viruses like influenza lack the proofreading mechanisms that DNA-based organisms have, so when they replicate, they make copying errors. Most of these errors are meaningless or harmful to the virus itself, but occasionally a mutation occurs that slightly changes the surface proteins. If that change helps the virus evade antibodies from previous infections or vaccinations, the mutated virus has an advantage. It can infect people who thought they were immune. This is why you can get the flu multiple times in your life. This is why last year's immunity doesn't guarantee protection this year. The virus is constantly drifting, shifting its appearance just enough to slip past our immune defenses. Antigenic shift is more dramatic. This occurs when two different influenza viruses infect the same cell, usually in an animal like a pig that can host both avian and human flu viruses, and their genetic material gets scrambled together. The result can be a completely new subtype of influenza, something the human population has never encountered before. When this happens, there's no existing immunity. No one's immune system recognizes the new virus. And that's when pandemics occur. That's what happened in 1918. That's what happened in 1957 with the Asian flu, an H2N2 strain that killed an estimated 1 to 2 million people. That's what happened in 1968 with the Hong Kong flu, an H3N2 strain that killed approximately 1 million. Each of these pandemics represented a major antigenic shift, the emergence of a novel flu virus that spread rapidly through an immunologically naive population. The relationship between humans, animals, and influenza viruses is complex and ancient. Wild waterfowl, particularly ducks and geese, are the natural reservoir for influenza A viruses. These birds carry the viruses in their intestines and shed them in their droppings, often without getting sick themselves. The viruses can survive in cold water, and migratory birds carry them across continents. When these avian viruses encounter domestic poultry, pigs, horses, or other animals in close proximity to humans, opportunities for cross-species transmission arise. Pigs are particularly important in this ecology because they have receptors for both avian and human flu viruses, making them potential mixing vessels where new strains can emerge. This brings us to a crucial point. Influenza is not just a human problem. It's a planetary ecosystem problem. The way we farm animals, the density of livestock operations, the overlap between wild bird habitats and agricultural zones, the global trade in live animals, All of these factors create countless opportunities for flu viruses to shuffle their genetics and produce new combinations. Every year, scientists monitor flu activity in animals as closely as they monitor it in humans, because the next pandemic strain is most likely already circulating somewhere in the animal world, waiting for the right circumstances to make the jump. This happened in 2009 with the H1N1 pandemic, often called swine flu, which originated from a virus that had genetic segments from bird, pig, and human flu viruses. The 2009 pandemic was illuminating in many ways. It demonstrated that even with a century of scientific progress since 1918, even with vaccines and antiviral drugs and global surveillance systems, a novel flu strain could still spread worldwide in a matter of months. The virus emerged in Mexico in the spring, was identified in April, and by June the World Health Organization had declared a pandemic. Within a year, it had reached every continent. The death toll was estimated between 150,000 and 575,000 people globally, significantly lower than the great pandemics of the 20th century, partly because the virus, while new, wasn't as virulent as the 1918 strain, and partly because public health responses were more coordinated. But it was a reminder. Pandemic flu is not a historical curiosity. It's an ongoing threat. Now let's talk about seasonal influenza, because this is the form most people actually encounter. Every year, like clockwork, flu season arrives. In the Northern Hemisphere, it typically runs from October through May, peaking in December through February. In the Southern Hemisphere, it's reversed, peaking during those regions' winter months. In tropical areas, patterns are less predictable, with flu circulating year-round or in multiple peaks. Why does flu surge in winter? Scientists have debated this for decades, and the answer is multifactorial. Cold, dry air helps the virus survive longer outside the body. The droplets that carry the virus remain airborne longer in low humidity conditions. People spend more time indoors in close proximity during cold weather, increasing transmission opportunities. Some research suggests that cold air may also impair the immune defenses in our nasal passages, making infection easier. But here's what makes seasonal flu both manageable and frustrating. It's predictable in its arrival, but not in its severity. Some years, flu season is mild, with relatively few hospitalizations and deaths. Other years, it's brutal, overwhelming healthcare systems and killing tens of thousands. In the United States alone, seasonal flu causes between 12,000 and 52,000 deaths annually, depending on the year, and hospitalizes hundreds of thousands. Globally, the World Health Organization estimates that seasonal flu kills between 290,000 and 650,000 people every year. These aren't pandemic numbers, but they represent an enormous, ongoing burden of disease and death that we've somehow normalized. We've accepted that every winter, a predictable number of people will die from influenza, and we've built that expectation into our healthcare planning. This is where vaccines enter the story. The first flu vaccines were developed in the 1940s, tested on military personnel during World War II, and made available to civilians in the following decades. Early vaccines were crude, often causing significant side effects, and weren't particularly effective. But they represented a massive step forward. The principle was simple. Expose the immune system to a killed or weakened version of the virus, or to pieces of the virus, and train the immune system to recognize and attack the real thing if it shows up later. The challenge with flu vaccines, unlike vaccines for diseases like measles or polio, is that flu viruses change constantly. A measles vaccine from 1960 still works against measles today because the measles virus is relatively stable. A flu vaccine from 1960 would be useless now because the flu viruses circulating today are genetically different. This means flu vaccines have to be updated every year. It's a massive logistical and scientific undertaking. Every February, the World Health Organization convenes experts to analyze flu surveillance data from around the globe. They look at which strains are circulating, how those strains are evolving, and they make an educated guess about which strains will dominate during the next flu season in each hemisphere. Based on these recommendations, vaccine manufacturers begin production. They grow the selected virus strains, usually in chicken eggs, a process that takes months. The vaccines are formulated, tested, distributed, and administered, all with the hope that the predictions were accurate. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're not. A good match between the vaccine and circulating strains can reduce illness by 40 to 60%. A poor match might only provide 10 to 20% effectiveness. But even in low effectiveness years, the vaccine reduces severity of illness in those who do get infected. Here's the question that haunts public health officials every year. Why don't more people get the flu vaccine? In most developed countries, it's widely available, often free or low cost, and recommended for everyone over 6 months old. Yet vaccination rates hover around 40 to 50% in many populations, lower in some demographics. The reasons are complex. Some people don't perceive flu as a serious threat. They've had it before, or think they have, and it was just a bad week. They don't realize that what they called flu might have been a bad cold, and that actual influenza can be debilitating or deadly. Some people distrust vaccines in general, influenced by misinformation that has spread particularly virally in the internet age. Some people simply can't be bothered, or forget, or face access barriers. And some people have legitimate concerns about side effects, though serious adverse reactions to flu vaccines are extremely rare. The result of incomplete vaccination coverage is that every year, millions of people get flu who didn't need to. Hospitals fill up. Emergency departments go on diversion. Intensive care units run out of beds. Elective surgeries get cancelled to free up resources. Healthcare workers get sick, creating staffing shortages at the exact moment demand surges. This is the seasonal crisis. Not a pandemic. Not a once-in-a-century catastrophe. Just the predictable, annual wave of influenza overwhelming systems that are perpetually running near capacity. In the United States, during bad flu years, hospitals implement crisis standards of care, setting up overflow tents, calling in retired personnel, rationing resources. This happens almost every winter somewhere in the country, and it's become so routine that it barely makes national news unless it's particularly severe. The people who die from seasonal flu are disproportionately the elderly, the very young, pregnant women, and people with chronic health conditions like asthma, diabetes, or heart disease. But healthy people die too. Every year, stories emerge of seemingly healthy children, teenagers, young adults who got the flu and deteriorated rapidly. Secondary bacterial pneumonia, sepsis, organ failure, death within days. These cases are statistically rare but devastating, and they serve as reminders that influenza is not benign. The virus attacks the respiratory tract, damaging the epithelial cells that line the airways. This damage creates openings for bacterial infections to take hold. Streptococcus pneumoniae, Staphylococcus aureus. These bacteria can invade damaged lung tissue and cause pneumonia that's far more dangerous than the flu itself. Treatment for influenza has improved but remains limited. Antiviral drugs like oseltamivir, commonly known as Tamiflu, can reduce the duration and severity of illness if taken within the first 48 hours of symptom onset. They work by inhibiting neuraminidase, one of the virus's key proteins, preventing new viral particles from leaving infected cells and spreading. But antivirals don't cure flu. They just slow it down, giving the immune system more time to mount an effective response. For people who are hospitalized with severe flu, treatment is largely supportive. Oxygen, fluids, mechanical ventilation if necessary, antibiotics if bacterial infection develops. There's no magic bullet. Once you're severely ill with flu, medicine can only support your body while it fights. This is why prevention is so critical, and why the annual vaccination campaign is so important. But there's a bigger question lurking beneath the seasonal routine. When will the next pandemic occur? Not if, when. Because influenza pandemics are not anomalies. They are features of the relationship between humans and these viruses. The planet hosts countless influenza viruses in animal reservoirs. Those viruses are constantly mutating, constantly encountering new hosts, constantly creating opportunities for a novel strain to emerge. Scientists talk about pandemic flu not as a possibility but as an inevitability. The only questions are when, which strain, and how severe. Surveillance systems now monitor flu activity globally with unprecedented sophistication. The World Health Organization coordinates a network of laboratories in over 100 countries, tracking flu strains, sequencing viral genomes, watching for signs of unusual activity. When clusters of severe respiratory illness appear, when a novel strain is detected, alarm bells ring. Officials run pandemic preparedness drills. Stockpiles of antiviral drugs are maintained. Vaccine development timelines are analyzed and optimized. But there's an uncomfortable truth underlying all this preparation. If a truly deadly pandemic strain emerges, if something with the transmissibility of 2009 H1N1 and the lethality of 1918 H1N1 appears, the world will struggle to contain it. Modern air travel means a virus that starts in one city can be on every continent within days. Urban density means transmission happens with extraordinary efficiency. And vaccine production, even with recent technological advances, still takes months. The emergence of mRNA vaccine technology, proven during the COVID-19 pandemic, offers hope for faster flu vaccine development in the future. Traditional flu vaccines take 6 months to produce because they rely on growing viruses in eggs, a slow and cumbersome process. mRNA vaccines can theoretically be designed and manufactured in weeks once the target virus is identified. Several companies are now developing mRNA-based flu vaccines, and some are in clinical trials. If these vaccines prove effective and can be produced at scale, they could revolutionize flu prevention, allowing for more accurate matching to circulating strains and faster response to pandemic threats. But this technology is still being refined, and it's not yet clear whether mRNA flu vaccines will work as well as mRNA COVID vaccines did. There's also research into universal flu vaccines, a kind of holy grail in influenza research. The idea is to develop a vaccine that targets parts of the virus that don't change, the conserved regions that are essential to the virus's function and therefore can't mutate without destroying the virus's ability to replicate. If such a vaccine could be created, it would provide long-lasting protection against all or most influenza strains, eliminating the need for annual vaccinations and providing a robust defense against pandemic strains. Several candidates are in various stages of development and testing. Some target the stalk of the hemagglutinin protein, rather than the head, because the stalk changes much more slowly. Some use innovative approaches involving viral vectors or nanoparticles to stimulate broader immune responses. None have reached market yet, but progress is being made. The dream is a single shot, or perhaps a series of shots in childhood, that provides lifetime protection against flu. We're not there yet, but we're closer than we've ever been. Meanwhile, the seasonal routine continues. Every fall, public health departments launch vaccination campaigns. Pharmacies advertise flu shots. Doctors remind patients. Schools send home permission slips. And every winter, despite all efforts, millions of people get sick. Some will be fine in a week. Some will end up in the hospital. Some will die. The system strains but doesn't break, usually, and then spring comes, flu activity declines, and we breathe easier until the cycle starts again. There's something almost ritualistic about it. This annual battle with a microscopic enemy we can't eliminate, only manage. It's become part of the rhythm of modern life, as predictable as seasons changing. But let's zoom out and consider the broader impact of influenza beyond individual suffering. The economic cost is staggering. In the United States alone, seasonal flu costs the economy an estimated $87 billion annually, accounting for medical expenses, lost productivity, and premature death. Globally, that number climbs into the hundreds of billions. Businesses lose employees to illness. Schools close when attendance drops too low. Healthcare systems spend enormous resources on surge capacity, maintaining empty beds and stockpiled equipment for the predictable annual crisis. And that's just seasonal flu. Pandemic flu costs are exponentially higher. The 2009 H1N1 pandemic cost the global economy an estimated $45 to $55 billion, and that was a relatively mild pandemic. A severe pandemic on the scale of 1918, adjusted for modern population and economic conditions, could cost trillions and cause global economic disruption comparable to a major war. There's also the psychological dimension. We live in a state of ambient awareness that infectious disease can erupt at any time. The COVID-19 pandemic made this awareness acute, bringing it from background concern to foreground crisis. But influenza has been training us for pandemic thinking for over a century. Every flu season is a small-scale rehearsal for the big one. We've learned to live with a certain level of infectious disease threat, to balance risk and normal life, to accept that gathering with others, especially indoors in winter, carries risks. This calculus has shaped architecture, behavior, social norms. Modern buildings have HVAC systems designed partly with disease transmission in mind. We've developed social conventions around coughing and sneezing, around staying home when sick, around hand hygiene. The flu has been a teacher, sometimes brutal, of how to coexist with contagion. One of the most interesting aspects of influenza is its inequality. The disease doesn't strike evenly across populations. People in poverty face higher risks, partly due to crowded living conditions that facilitate transmission, partly due to limited access to healthcare and vaccines, partly due to higher rates of underlying health conditions that make flu more dangerous. Essential workers who can't work from home, who depend on public transportation, who interact with many people daily, face higher exposure. Globally, the burden of flu falls hardest on low- and middle-income countries where healthcare resources are limited and surveillance systems are weaker. A pandemic that might cause widespread illness but manageable mortality in wealthy nations can be catastrophic in regions without adequate healthcare infrastructure. This disparity extends to vaccine access. Rich countries purchase the bulk of vaccine supply, leaving poorer nations with little or none during shortages. The 2009 pandemic highlighted this starkly. When H1N1 vaccine became available, wealthy nations had secured advance orders for most of the global supply. Poorer countries had to wait months, and by the time vaccines reached some regions, the pandemic wave had already passed. International organizations have since worked to improve vaccine equity, establishing stockpiles and advance agreements to ensure broader distribution during pandemics. But structural inequalities remain, and it's virtually certain that in the next pandemic, vaccine nationalism will again emerge, with nations prioritizing their own populations over global need. This isn't just a moral problem. It's a practical one. Viruses don't respect borders. A pandemic that rages unchecked in one region can produce new variants that spread globally, undermining control efforts everywhere. Global health is interconnected, and influenza forces us to confront that reality every year. Children play a special role in flu transmission. They're efficient spreaders, shedding virus at high levels and for longer periods than adults. They have close contact with many peers at school and daycare. They're not great at respiratory hygiene, and they bring the virus home to parents and siblings. School closures have been used as a pandemic control measure for this reason. During the 1918 pandemic, cities that closed schools early had lower death rates than those that didn't. But school closures come with massive social and economic costs. Parents can't work. Children miss education. The most vulnerable students lose access to meals and support services. So the decision to close schools during flu outbreaks involves painful trade-offs. In recent years, there's been increasing emphasis on vaccinating children not just to protect them, but to reduce community transmission. Some countries have implemented school-based vaccination programs with impressive results, achieving high coverage and reducing overall flu activity. Let's talk about the hospital surge problem in more detail, because this is where the seasonal impact of flu becomes most visible and most critical. Hospital capacity is generally calculated to handle normal patient loads with some buffer for spikes. But that buffer is not infinite, and flu season tests it every year. Emergency departments see a surge in respiratory illness complaints. Many of these patients don't need hospital admission, but evaluating them takes time and resources. Those who do need admission often require isolation to prevent spreading flu to other patients. This reduces effective bed capacity. Intensive care units fill with the most severe cases, patients needing mechanical ventilation, close monitoring, aggressive treatment. These patients require high staffing ratios, multiple nurses per patient, specialized equipment. When ICUs fill, new critical patients have nowhere to go. Hospitals respond with surge protocols. They cancel elective procedures, freeing up beds and staff. They convert spaces like conference rooms into temporary patient areas. They call in off-duty staff. They transfer patients to other facilities if possible. But these measures have limits. Staff can't work endless hours without making dangerous errors. Canceling surgeries harms patients who need those procedures. And if flu season coincides with other crises, a bad accident, a multi-casualty event, a heat wave or cold snap that strains resources in other ways, the system can break. This has happened. In recent years, multiple U.S. hospitals have declared internal disasters during flu season, acknowledging they couldn't meet patient demand with available resources. Ambulances have been turned away. Patients have waited for days in emergency departments for inpatient beds. People have died waiting. The healthcare workers themselves are part of the equation. They face intense pressure during flu season, working longer hours, facing higher infection risk, dealing with sicker patients and resource constraints. Burnout in healthcare was a crisis before COVID-19, and flu season has been contributing to it for decades. Many healthcare workers get vaccinated, but not all, and even vaccinated individuals can get flu, especially if the vaccine match is poor that year. When staff get sick during peak season, already stretched teams become critically short-staffed. Some hospitals have implemented mandatory flu vaccination for staff, a controversial policy that has improved vaccination rates but also sparked resistance from some workers who object to mandatory medical interventions. The ethics of this are debated, balancing individual autonomy against collective patient safety. Now, let's turn to a darker development. Influenza viruses can become resistant to antiviral drugs, just as bacteria develop antibiotic resistance. This has already happened with some older flu drugs. Amantadine and rimantadine, early antiviral medications, are no longer effective against most circulating flu strains because resistance is so widespread. Oseltamivir resistance has emerged sporadically, more commonly in certain strains like H1N1, though it's not yet widespread. But the potential for widespread resistance is real and worrying. If resistance to oseltamivir and other neuraminidase inhibitors becomes common, we lose one of our few tools for treating severe flu. This would be especially catastrophic during a pandemic when antiviral drugs are a critical bridge until vaccines become available. Surveillance for antiviral resistance is ongoing, and when resistant strains are detected, treatment guidelines are adjusted. But we're in an arms race with the virus, trying to stay one step ahead. There's also the specter of bioterrorism or accidental release of dangerous flu strains. Scientists have conducted controversial gain-of-function research, intentionally making flu viruses more transmissible or lethal in laboratory settings to understand how pandemic strains might emerge naturally. This research has yielded important insights but has also drawn intense criticism for creating potential pandemic agents in labs. What if such a virus escaped? What if someone with malicious intent obtained it? Security at research facilities is tight, but no system is perfect. The debates over gain-of-function research are fierce, balancing scientific freedom and pandemic preparedness against biocontainment risks. There are no easy answers, only difficult trade-offs between knowledge and danger. Let's consider the intersection of flu and other health threats. People with chronic conditions are more vulnerable to flu, but flu also exacerbates those conditions. Someone with well-controlled asthma might have a severe asthma attack triggered by flu. Someone with stable heart disease might experience heart failure after flu infection due to the stress the virus places on the body. Flu during pregnancy increases risks of complications for both mother and baby. In elderly populations, flu can trigger a cascade of decline, a person entering flu season independent and functional, leaving it weakened, hospitalized, and needing long-term care. These indirect impacts of flu are substantial and often underappreciated. The death certificates might say pneumonia or heart failure, but the underlying cause was flu. There's also interaction between flu and other circulating pathogens. In a given winter, flu isn't the only respiratory virus active. Respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV, circulates at similar times, particularly affecting infants and elderly. Rhinoviruses, the common cold viruses, are always around. Coronaviruses, not just SARS-CoV-2 but the endemic coronaviruses that cause colds, are part of the mix. When multiple respiratory viruses co-circulate, they can interact in complex ways. Sometimes infection with one virus provides temporary protection against others, a phenomenon called viral interference. Sometimes co-infections occur, making people sicker than they would be with either virus alone. The 2020 to 2021 flu season was remarkably mild, likely because COVID-19 control measures like masking and distancing also suppressed flu transmission. But as those measures relaxed, flu came roaring back, sometimes with unusual timing and intensity. The climate change dimension is increasingly recognized. As global temperatures rise, the patterns of flu circulation may shift. Milder winters in traditionally cold regions might alter seasonal dynamics. Changes in bird migration patterns due to climate shifts could affect how flu viruses move geographically. Extreme weather events, which are becoming more frequent, can disrupt healthcare services and create conditions for disease outbreaks. Flooding can contaminate water supplies and force people into crowded shelters. Hurricanes and wildfires can overwhelm healthcare systems already stretched by flu season. The interconnections between environmental change and infectious disease are deep and not fully understood, but it's clear that flu doesn't exist in isolation from larger ecological shifts. Indigenous populations and other marginalized communities have historically borne disproportionate flu burdens. During the 1918 pandemic, indigenous peoples in the Americas and elsewhere were devastated, with some communities losing a significant portion of their population. This wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of colonial policies that created poverty, displacement, and limited access to healthcare. Similar patterns persist today. Flu vaccination rates are often lower in indigenous communities. Access to healthcare is more limited. Underlying health disparities make flu more dangerous. And cultural factors, including historical mistrust of government health interventions due to past abuses, complicate public health efforts. Addressing these disparities requires more than just providing vaccines. It requires building trust, addressing social determinants of health, and involving communities in designing and implementing interventions. Let's return to the science for a moment, because the more we learn about influenza, the more complex and impressive it becomes. The influenza genome is made of 8 separate RNA segments. When 2 different flu viruses infect the same cell, these segments can mix and match, a process called reassortment. It's like shuffling 2 decks of cards together and dealing a new hand that has cards from both decks. This is how major antigenic shifts happen, how pandemic strains emerge. But even within a single infection, the virus population is incredibly diverse. Each time the virus replicates, small errors occur. Most individual viruses in a flu infection are slightly different from each other, a swarm of variants called a viral quasispecies. This diversity is the raw material for evolution. When the immune system attacks or when antiviral drugs are used, the vast majority of viruses might be killed, but if even a few have mutations that confer resistance, those survivors will replicate and dominate. The virus evolves in real time within the body. The structure of the flu virus is elegant in its simplicity. It's basically a protein shell, the capsid, surrounding the 8 RNA segments that encode just 11 to 14 proteins, depending on the strain. That's it. With fewer than 15 proteins, influenza can invade cells, hijack cellular machinery, replicate, and spread. The hemagglutinin protein binds to sialic acid receptors on host cells, initiating infection. The neuraminidase protein cleaves sialic acid, allowing new viral particles to escape and spread. The RNA polymerase complex copies the viral genome. Other proteins help package the genome, suppress host immune responses, and assemble new viral particles. It's a masterpiece of biological efficiency, and it's been refined through millions of years of evolution, long before humans existed. Birds are the deep origin. Influenza A has likely been circulating in waterfowl for millennia, perhaps much longer. These viruses replicate in the bird's intestines, are shed in feces, and spread through water. Infected birds usually don't get sick. The relationship is almost commensal. The virus replicates and spreads without killing its host. But when these avian viruses encounter mammals, the situation changes. Mammalian immune systems react differently. Mammalian cells have different receptors. For a flu virus to successfully infect mammals, particularly humans, it needs specific adaptations. Avian flu viruses bind to receptors that are common in bird intestines but rare in human respiratory tracts. Human flu viruses have adapted to bind to receptors abundant in our upper airways. This receptor specificity is one of the barriers that prevents most bird flu strains from easily infecting humans. But it's not an absolute barrier. It can be overcome through mutation or reassortment. This brings us to the ongoing threat of avian influenza, particularly H5N1. This strain emerged in the 1990s and has caused sporadic human infections, almost always in people with direct contact with infected poultry. The mortality rate in confirmed human cases of H5N1 is terrifyingly high, over 50%. But human-to-human transmission has been extremely limited. The virus hasn't adapted for efficient spread between people. Yet, the fear is that if H5N1 acquires the right mutations, or if it reassorts with a human flu virus, it could combine its high lethality with efficient human transmission. That would be a pandemic scenario beyond anything we've seen in modern times. Surveillance of avian flu is intense. Outbreaks in poultry are met with culling of entire flocks. People who work with birds are monitored. Vaccines against H5N1 have been developed and stockpiled. But if a pandemic strain emerges, there will be a lag before those vaccines can be adapted and deployed at scale. The modern poultry industry creates ideal conditions for flu virus evolution and spread. Millions of birds housed in close proximity, genetically similar due to selective breeding, stressed, and often with immune systems compromised by the demands of intensive production. These are perfect conditions for a virus to spread rapidly and evolve. Periodic outbreaks of avian flu require massive culls, millions of birds destroyed to prevent spread. These culls are economically devastating and raise animal welfare concerns, but they're deemed necessary to prevent both economic damage from widespread infection and to reduce the risk of viruses adapting to humans. Similar concerns exist with pig farming. Pigs, as mentioned, can host both bird and human flu viruses. Large-scale pig operations, especially in regions where they're in proximity to poultry and wild birds, are high-risk sites for the emergence of novel flu strains. There's a fundamental tension in our relationship with influenza. The same factors that have allowed human civilization to thrive, dense urban populations, global trade and travel, industrial-scale animal agriculture, also create optimal conditions for flu viruses to spread and evolve. We can't eliminate flu without fundamentally restructuring society, and even then, the virus would persist in animal reservoirs. So we manage. We vaccinate. We surveil. We prepare. We accept a baseline level of disease and death. And we hope that the next big one isn't too big, that we have time to respond, that the tools we've developed will be enough. It's an uneasy coexistence, and it's not clear how long it's sustainable. Technology offers some hope. Advances in genomic sequencing allow us to track flu evolution with unprecedented precision. We can identify emerging strains quickly, understand their characteristics, and adjust vaccines accordingly. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are being applied to predict flu evolution, to forecast which strains will dominate in coming seasons, potentially improving vaccine match. Telemedicine and digital health tools can extend the reach of healthcare during surges. But technology alone won't solve the problem. The flu virus is a product of biology and ecology, shaped by evolution over eons. It's patient, it's adaptable, and it has a built-in advantage. It evolves much faster than we do. Public health infrastructure is the foundation of flu defense, and it's chronically underfunded in many places. Disease surveillance requires laboratories, trained personnel, data systems, and coordination across jurisdictions. Vaccination campaigns require cold chain logistics, trained vaccinators, public education, and systems to track who's been vaccinated. Pandemic preparedness requires stockpiles, plans, exercises, and surge capacity. All of this costs money, and when flu isn't causing a crisis, it's easy for policymakers to cut budgets, to defer investments, to assume things will be fine. Then a bad flu season hits, or a pandemic emerges, and suddenly everyone asks why we weren't better prepared. The answer is usually that preparation is expensive and politically unrewarding. There are no ribbon cuttings for disasters that didn't happen because prevention worked. The role of media and communication in flu response is critical and complicated. During a pandemic, public trust in health authorities can mean the difference between effective and ineffective response. Clear, consistent, honest communication is essential. But trust is fragile, built slowly and destroyed quickly. Mixed messages, perceptions of dishonesty or incompetence, politicization of health issues, all of these erode trust. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated both the power and the fragility of public health communication. Misinformation spread rapidly, often faster than factual information. Social media algorithms amplified sensational and divisive content. Trust in institutions was tested and, in some cases, shattered. The lessons from COVID will shape how future flu pandemics are communicated, but it's not clear we've fully learned them yet. One of the most persistent questions about flu is why we can't just eradicate it, the way we eradicated smallpox. The answer is multifaceted. Smallpox only infected humans, had no animal reservoir, and had a very stable genome. Once humans were vaccinated globally, the virus had nowhere to go. It was driven extinct. Flu is the opposite. It has vast animal reservoirs. Its genome is constantly changing. A vaccine that works today might not work next year. And even within humans, flu can establish chronic infections in immunocompromised individuals, providing another reservoir. Eradication would require simultaneously eliminating the virus from all birds, all pigs, all humans, and any other potential hosts, while also preventing any new strains from evolving. It's not realistically possible with current technology. The best we can hope for is control, reducing the burden of disease to manageable levels and preventing pandemics. There's also the issue of flu's global distribution. Even if one country achieved perfect vaccination coverage and eliminated local transmission, travelers would reintroduce the virus from elsewhere. In our interconnected world, diseases like flu are global commons problems. They can't be solved by individual nations acting alone. International cooperation is essential, but it's politically difficult, especially when nations have competing interests or limited resources. The World Health Organization provides a framework for cooperation, but it has limited enforcement power. Countries share surveillance data voluntarily, but not always completely or quickly. Vaccine sharing agreements are works in progress. The global flu response is a patchwork of national systems with varying capabilities and priorities, coordinated imperfectly through international mechanisms that are perpetually underfunded and understaffed. Let's consider the personal level for a moment. What does flu mean for an individual? For most people most of the time, it means a week of misery. High fever, maybe 103 or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Body ache so severe that lying still hurts. Crushing fatigue. Cough. Sore throat. Headache. Chills and sweats. Complete loss of appetite. Flu is not a bad cold. Colds are annoying. Flu is incapacitating. Most people who've had real influenza know they've had it. They remember it. And then it passes, the fever breaks, strength gradually returns, and in a week or two, they're mostly back to normal, though fatigue can linger. But for some, the trajectory is different. The fever doesn't break. Breathing becomes difficult. Lips turn blue. Confusion sets in. This is the turn toward severe disease, toward hospitalization, toward the possibility of death. And the terrible thing is, you can't always predict who will take that turn. It's more common in high-risk groups, but anyone can get severe flu. The experience of healthcare workers during severe flu seasons is harrowing. Emergency departments become war zones. Every exam room full, patients lining hallways on stretchers, more arriving by ambulance every few minutes. The exhausted physician moving from one critically ill patient to the next, making rapid decisions about who needs immediate intervention, who can wait, who needs admission, who can go home with instructions to return if worse. The nurse juggling too many patients, administering medications, monitoring vital signs, trying to provide comfort when there's barely time. The respiratory therapist managing multiple patients on ventilators, adjusting settings, troubleshooting alarms, keeping fragile lungs functioning. The environmental services staff cleaning rooms as fast as they can, knowing that every delay means a patient waits longer. The fear of bringing infection home to their own families. The moral injury of feeling like they can't provide the level of care they're trained to give because there simply aren't enough resources. This happens every year. We ask healthcare workers to endure this, and many of them burn out and leave the profession. For families, severe flu is devastating. One day, someone you love is fine. A few days later, they're in the ICU on a ventilator. You're receiving updates in medical jargon you don't fully understand. You're making decisions about aggressive treatment versus comfort care. You're wondering if you'll ever speak to them again. And then either they slowly recover, a long process of weaning from the ventilator, physical therapy, rehabilitation, or they don't. They deteriorate despite all interventions. Organs fail. The medical team gently suggests withdrawing life support. And you're faced with the unthinkable, losing someone to a disease that most people think of as minor, something you can get a free vaccine for at the grocery store. The cruelty of preventable death is especially sharp. There are flu survivors who never fully recover. Post-viral syndromes are real and can be debilitating. Chronic fatigue, difficulty concentrating, persistent breathing problems, reduced exercise tolerance. Some people develop myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome following flu or other viral infections, a poorly understood condition that can render people unable to work or engage in normal activities for months or years. The long-term burden of flu extends far beyond the acute illness and immediate deaths. It includes all of these shadow cases, the people whose lives are diminished by the aftermath of infection. This is another reason why prevention matters. It's not just about preventing death, though that's paramount. It's about preventing all the harm that flu causes, the full spectrum from inconvenience to catastrophe. Now, let's talk about influenza in the context of other global health challenges. We live in an era of converging crises. Climate change, antimicrobial resistance, pandemic threats, chronic disease epidemics, health inequity. Flu intersects with all of these. Climate change alters disease ecology. Antimicrobial resistance complicates treatment of bacterial infections that follow flu. Flu is one of several pandemic threats, alongside novel coronaviruses, Ebola, and others. The chronic diseases that make flu more dangerous, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, are increasingly prevalent. And as discussed, flu disproportionately affects disadvantaged populations. Solving these problems requires integrated approaches, not siloed interventions. Yet our healthcare and public health systems are often fragmented, with different programs addressing different issues in isolation. Flu response would be more effective if embedded in broader health system strengthening. The economics of vaccine development and production are complex and not always aligned with public health needs. Flu vaccines are a seasonal product with unpredictable demand. Some years, uptake is high. Other years, people skip it. Manufacturers have to make production decisions months in advance based on demand predictions. If they produce too much, they lose money on unsold doses. If they produce too little, there are shortages. The profit margins on flu vaccines are relatively thin compared to blockbuster drugs. This means there's limited incentive for companies to invest heavily in improving flu vaccines or developing new technologies unless there's guaranteed market or government funding. Public-private partnerships have been developed to de-risk vaccine development, with governments committing to purchase certain quantities or providing research funding. But these mechanisms are imperfect, and we're still dependent on a small number of manufacturers for global flu vaccine supply. One promising development is the increased focus on equity in pandemic preparedness. International initiatives like COVAX, developed during COVID-19, aim to ensure that vaccines and treatments are available to all countries, not just the wealthy. Similar frameworks are being discussed for flu and other pandemic threats. But these initiatives are underfunded and politically contentious. Rich countries are reluctant to commit resources without guaranteeing supplies for their own populations first. Pharmaceutical companies resist intellectual property sharing that could enable generic production in lower-income countries. The tension between national interest and global solidarity is real and unresolved. Until we genuinely embrace the principle that global health is interconnected, that diseases anywhere are threats everywhere, these tensions will persist. Education plays a crucial role in flu prevention. People need to understand what flu is, how it spreads, why vaccination matters, and what to do if they get sick. Health literacy varies widely, and messages must be tailored to different audiences. What resonates with a college-educated professional might not work for someone with limited formal education. Language barriers exist. Cultural beliefs about illness and medicine vary. Some communities have traditional healing practices and may be skeptical of Western medicine. Effective flu education requires cultural competence, meeting people where they are, addressing concerns without judgment, and building on existing knowledge. This is slow, difficult work that doesn't produce instant results, but it's foundational. The influenza story is ultimately a story about vulnerability and resilience. We are vulnerable to this virus in ways that our technology and wealth can only partially mitigate. We evolved in small groups, and our immune systems are calibrated for that scale. We now live in cities of millions, connected by global networks that move people and pathogens around the planet in hours. We're ecologically vulnerable because we've transformed landscapes and agricultural systems in ways that bring humans, livestock, and wildlife into close contact. We're socially vulnerable because of inequalities that leave some people far more exposed and less protected than others. But we're also resilient. We've developed vaccines and treatments. We've built surveillance systems and public health infrastructure. We've created scientific knowledge that allows us to understand and respond to the threat. And we've endured. Every pandemic in history has ended, not always because we defeated it, but because humans adapt and survive. Looking forward, the question is whether we can move beyond mere survival to actual control. Can we develop universal flu vaccines that provide lasting protection? Can we improve surveillance to catch emerging threats earlier? Can we build healthcare systems with true surge capacity that doesn't rely on burning out workers? Can we address the social and economic inequalities that make flu so much more dangerous for some populations? Can we reform animal agriculture to reduce pandemic risk? Can we strengthen international cooperation so that flu response is genuinely global? These are all possible, but they require sustained commitment and resources. They require treating pandemic preparedness as a continuous priority, not something we remember only when crisis hits. There's also the question of personal responsibility versus collective action. Getting a flu shot is a personal decision, but it has collective implications. The more people who are vaccinated, the less the virus circulates, and the fewer people get sick. This is herd immunity. It protects those who can't be vaccinated, infants too young, people with certain medical conditions, people for whom the vaccine doesn't work well. When vaccination rates drop, outbreaks become larger and more severe. So individual choices aggregate into community-level outcomes. Public health asks us to think beyond ourselves, to accept minor inconvenience or discomfort for collective benefit. This is a hard sell in cultures that emphasize individualism, but it's essential for managing diseases like flu that spread through communities. The influenza virus doesn't care about politics, economics, or human drama. It's a biological entity following evolutionary imperatives, replicating, mutating, spreading. It's not malicious or intentional. It simply does what successful pathogens do: find hosts, reproduce, spread to new hosts. Humans are good hosts. We're numerous, we congregate, we travel, we're susceptible. From the virus's perspective, we're a resource. From our perspective, the virus is a threat. And so we're locked in this ongoing struggle, evolutionary and technological, trying to outsmart an entity that evolves faster than we can adapt. It's a humbling reminder that despite our technology and civilization, we remain biological creatures, subject to the same fundamental forces of nature that shape all life on Earth. The seasonal surge that keeps hospitals on edge every winter is not inevitable in the sense that it's written into the laws of physics. It's the result of specific conditions, viral evolution, human behavior, social structures, policy choices. Different choices could produce different outcomes. Better vaccination rates would reduce surges. Improved hospital capacity would make surges more manageable. Stronger surveillance might give earlier warnings. But making these changes requires political will, sustained funding, and social cohesion. It requires valuing prevention even when there's no immediate crisis. It requires investing in systems and infrastructure that are invisible when they work well. These are difficult things to achieve in any political system, but especially in systems facing competing demands and limited resources. As we close this long journey through influenza history and impact, consider this. Right now, somewhere in the world, a child is getting their first flu infection. Their immune system is encountering influenza for the first time, learning to recognize and fight it. They'll probably be miserable for a week, then recover, and their immune system will remember. Right now, somewhere else, an elderly person with multiple chronic conditions is fighting a flu infection that will kill them within days. Their immune system, aged and weakened, can't mount an effective response. Right now, in a laboratory, a virologist is sequencing the genomes of flu samples from around the world, looking for signs of evolution, for the emergence of new variants. Right now, in a vaccine production facility, next year's flu vaccine is being manufactured, grown in millions of chicken eggs, purified, formulated, prepared for distribution. Right now, in a hospital, a nurse is adjusting the ventilator settings for a flu patient, trying to keep their oxygen levels stable. And right now, in a wetland somewhere, a duck is shedding influenza virus in its feces, continuing a cycle that has played out for countless generations, long before humans existed and will likely continue long after we're gone. The complete history of influenza is the history of a relationship between humans and a virus, mediated by ecology, technology, and social organization. It's a relationship that has killed hundreds of millions of people over the centuries, that costs billions in economic damage every year, that shapes healthcare systems and public health policy. It's also a relationship that has driven scientific discovery, that has taught us about virology and immunology and epidemiology, that has shown us both our vulnerability and our capacity to respond to biological threats. We haven't defeated influenza, and likely never will completely, but we've learned to coexist with it, imperfectly, at significant cost, but we've survived. The question for the future is whether we can do better than survival, whether we can achieve true control, or whether flu will always be with us, a seasonal surge, a pandemic threat, a reminder that for all our accomplishments, we remain subject to the ancient rules of biology and evolution. If you made it this far, through 16,000 words of flu history and science and impact, thank you. This is the story we needed to tell, the full scope of a disease that touches every human life but often goes unexamined. If you found value in this deep dive, subscribe to this channel and like this video. Share it with someone who needs to understand why flu matters, why that annual vaccine reminder isn't trivial, why pandemic preparedness deserves resources and attention. The next deep investigation is coming soon, and I think you'll want to be there for it. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and maybe go get your flu shot if you haven't already. See you in the next one.